There's a specific kind of discomfort that comes with watching something in your business that you can't quite put your finger on. It's not an alarm, it's more like a low frequency hum that's been in the background for a while. A person on your team who's been a little bit different lately, not dramatically, not in a way that you could point to in a performance review and say, here's the problem, just different. The energy has shifted, the effort has declined ever so subtly. Something that used to be there isn't, and you can't quite articulate what it is. Maybe there's been a conversation you heard about secondhand. Perhaps there's been a deal that didn't get the same attention that it usually would. Or perhaps they've been a little bit quieter in team meetings and possibly you've noticed they're just not as hungry as they were 6 months ago, or they seem a bit distracted in a way that's hard to put your finger on. And you've been giving it time because the evidence isn't definitive, because you've backed this person and you believe in the decision that you made to bring them in. After all, things could turn around and you don't want to overreact to something that might resolve itself. Well, today's episode is about what happens when you do that, and more importantly, it's about what you should do instead. Welcome to episode 274 of Commercial Real Estate Leadership. My name is Darren Krakowiak and I help commercial real estate principals to build an agency that can run without them so they have the choice to work on or off the tools. And when I work through a departure with a principal after the fact, when we go back and we look through what happened and when, there's almost always a moment, a specific thing. Not the person leaving itself, something earlier, something that at the time seemed explainable or manageable or not quite enough to act on. But in hindsight, it was always the point. Now, most people would call this a red flag. And in my experience, it almost always takes one of a few forms. Sometimes it's a performance shift, not a collapse, a drift. Numbers that were tracking well start to plateau. Follow-up that used to be quick gets slower. Deals that should have been closed within a certain time frame take longer than they should. Individually, each of these things can be explained, but together they're a pattern. Sometimes it's an attitude or engagement shift. The person who used to drive conversations in team meetings starts going quiet. The one who always had opinions about how things should be done stops offering their opinions, or the reverse. Someone who was collaborative suddenly becomes subtly resistant. The change is real, but it's hard to document, so it goes unchecked. And then, of course, sometimes it's more direct. It's a conversation that gets back to the principal through the market, a LinkedIn profile that has been updated in a way that signals something, an approach from a competitor that the principal hears about. These ones are harder to rationalize, but the principals still do because acting on them feels premature, and they'd rather be wrong about what they're seeing than right. Now, this is what I want you to hear. The red flag is rarely enough evidence on its own at the time to justify a definitive response. And that's what makes it hard. It's a bit ambiguous. It could appear innocuous, but when you look closer, it is enough evidence to justify a conversation. Although in most cases, the conversation doesn't happen. The principal gives it more time, and that red flag moment becomes the beginning of an accumulation that ends in a departure of an employee and a moment of clear retrospective regret. So let me ask you directly, is there a red flag in your business right now? Let's talk about why principals don't act on the red flag when they see it. I've worked through this with enough commercial real estate principals now that I think I can give you an honest answer, and it's not the one that most podcasts will give you if they even cover this topic at all. It's not usually about avoiding a difficult conversation. Commercial real estate principals are not, as a group, people who shy away from the hard things. They've had tough negotiations. They've managed difficult clients. They know how to be direct when they need to be. What's actually happening is something different. It's about the decision they've already made. When you bring someone into your business, particularly when you've backed them, someone you've invested time and energy and given them your trust, that decision comes part of how you see yourself as a leader. And a red flag at some level is a challenge to that decision. It's evidence that the call you made might not have been the right one. And so maybe unconsciously, you raise the bar for how much evidence you need to see before you act. Because acting means conceding that the decision was wrong. And that's uncomfortable in a way that feels very different from just managing a problem. So you give it more time. You tell yourself that the evidence isn't definitive, that things could turn around, that you'd rather be wrong about what you're seeing than right. And you keep investing more time, more patience, giving them more benefit of the doubt in a situation that the original red flag was already telling you was going in the wrong direction. Now, this is not a weakness. It is a completely understandable response to a genuinely ambiguous situation. But I'm highlighting it here because I think most commercial real estate principals who have been through a departure and look back will recognize this pattern in themselves. The red flag was there. The evidence felt insufficient. They gave it more time, and the moment they now wish they'd acted on was usually the original red flag. The question I want to put to you is this. If you're watching something in your business right now and giving it more time, how much of that is genuine ambiguity and how much of it is protecting a decision that you've already made? Here's something I want to say to you clearly, because I think it changes how you think about what's in front of you. The period between the first signal and the actual departure, if it comes to that, is not dead time. It's not a waiting room. It's a window. And most principals spend it hoping things will resolve rather than using it deliberately. Today, I want to give you 4 specific things that you can do with that window that will leave your business in a materially better position, whether that person stays or goes. The first thing to do is to have a direct conversation, not a performance review, not a general check-in, a specific, honest conversation about what you've observed and what you need to see. I know this feels like the hardest one, and indeed it may be awkward, but the principal who has this conversation calmly, directly, without ultimatums, is almost always better off than the one who doesn't, regardless of how the conversation goes. If the person is disengaged and the conversation brings that to the surface, you have new information. You can decide what to do with it. If the person is not planning to leave or you've misread the signals, you've still addressed something that was sitting there, and that's almost always a useful thing to do. When handled appropriately, what the direct conversation almost never does is make things worse than they already are. What it consistently does is give you clarity that you didn't already have. The second thing is to extract and document the knowledge that currently lives only in that person's head. Every business has it, the client context that's never been written down, a process that exists because one person figured it out and no one else has learned how to do it, the relationship history that's stored in their memory rather than written down in your CRM. When that person leaves, the knowledge goes with them unless you act now. This is not a comfortable conversation to have because it signals that you're thinking about their departure. And that's why most principals don't do it until it's too late. But it can be framed as a business maturity initiative. We're documenting processes and knowledge across the team. It doesn't have to be about them specifically. In fact, it's better if it isn't. The important thing here is that it gets done while there's still time to do it properly. The third thing is to begin redistributing client relationships that are currently personal to that individual. Not all of them, that would be a bit disruptive and maybe a tad obvious, but the key ones. Start introducing other members of your team into those relationships now, while the incumbent is still there to make the introduction feel natural. A warm handover, or even a partial one, is worth significantly more than a cold one after the person is gone. The principal who has done this work has options when the departure happens. The principal who hasn't is left managing a client retention issue on top of an operational one. The fourth thing is the most structural and in some ways the most important. Use this window to assess what the business has built around this person that it shouldn't have. What decisions flow through them? What client relationships are entirely personal to them? What processes only work because of how they specifically do them? This is the structural audit that most principals only do after the departure forces them to. Doing it now while there's still time to act on what you find is the difference between a departure that exposes vulnerability and a departure that you were ready for. Now let's talk about what happens when a person's left. And when they're a key person, I think the instinct is to replace them. And the pressure to do it quickly is real. There's a gap in the business. Clients are noticing. The remaining team members are carrying extra load. I understand why the default response is to find someone with a similar profile and to get them in the door. But here's what can happen when principals do that. They hire someone into the same role with the same structure around it. And 6, 12, maybe 18 months later, the same problems emerge because the person was replaced, but the conditions that produced the problem were not. Before you hire, I want you to do one thing. Define the role as it should exist, not as it did exist. What are the actual responsibilities of this position? Not what the last person ended up doing because things evolved organically that way over time. What should this role specifically own, deliver, and be accountable for? Where does it interact with you, with the rest of the team, and with clients? What does good performance in this role look like in concrete, measurable terms? Most commercial real estate principals don't have this stuff written down. They hired based on a general sense of what they needed, and the role took shape around the person who filled it. Which means when that person leaves, they're not replacing a role, they're replacing a person. And those are two very different things. Doing this work before you advertise is not about slowing down the process. It's about making the process faster and more likely to succeed. A principal who knows exactly what they're hiring for will move through the recruitment more efficiently, assess candidates more accurately, and onboard the successful person more effectively than one who is still figuring out the role while interviewing for it. So the sequence is define the role early, hire with confidence into that definition, and move quickly once the definition is right. What you're not doing is rushing the definition. That part has to come first. Now, I want to talk about one more thing, and I want to define it because I think naming it changes how you relate to the time that you have right now. And I'm going to call it the departure window. It's the period between the first clear signal and the moment that the person actually leaves the business. And it is the most valuable and most consistently wasted time in the life cycle of a key person departure. Most principals spend the departure window in one of two ways. Either they're in denial, they're hoping things resolve, they're giving it more time, they're not ready to name what they've already seen, or they're in reaction mode. They've accepted it's going to happen and they're already thinking about the replacement. Neither of those is the right way to use the departure window. The right use of the window is the four things that we've just covered: the direct conversation, the knowledge extraction, the relationship redistribution, and the structural audit. Done well, those four things mean that by the time the departure happens, if it happens, the business is in a fundamentally different position than it would have been if you just spent your time in the window waiting. And here's the other thing about the departure window. Sometimes using it properly prevents the departure entirely. The direct conversation services something that was fixable and nobody had named. The structural changes make the role more sustainable. The person stays because the conditions improved. But it happens more often than principals expect when they actually use the departure window rather than just wait it out. So I want to start wrapping up this episode with an observation that I think is useful. So here it is. When I look back with commercial real estate principals on departures that were handled well and departures that weren't handled well, the difference is almost never about what happened after the person left. It's about what happened before. The principals who were in the best position after a departure were the ones who'd used the departure window. They're the ones who'd had the conversation, who documented the knowledge, who'd started redistributing the relationships and done the structural work that the departure was going to force them to do anyway. They just did it while they still had time. The ones who struggled were the ones who waited, who gave it more time past the point where more time was useful, who replaced the person before they defined the role, who found out on the day the person walked out how much was sitting in that person's head with no documentation and how many clients were going to be very difficult to hang on to. If you're watching something in your business right now, and if there's a red flag that you've decided just needs more time to resolve or isn't really that big of a deal, I want to say this to you clearly. The window is open. You have time to use it. Not indefinitely, but right now, today, you have something that principals in the aftermath of the departure would give a lot to have back. So don't spend it waiting. If you're in this situation and you want to think through how to use the window well, how to have the direct conversation, how to do the structural audit, how to redesign the role before you hire, this is the kind of work that I do with commercial real estate principals. It's specific to commercial real estate because the dynamics here are different from any other business context. And the stakes around client relationships and market reputation are high enough that getting it right matters. Find me on LinkedIn, Darren Krakowiak, send me a message, tell me what you're seeing in your business. I'll get back to you personally and we can talk through it. That's our episode for today. Thank you so much for listening. I will speak to you soon.